sort of look at you. Yeah. All right.
It's just a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to start by having you say and spell your first and last name.
Say and spell. I go by my first initial. Oh, you want my last name? I'm off to a bad start here.
That's okay.
Watson, spelled Watson.
And your first name is?
First name, which I never use, is an old family name, R-O-E, Roe.
Middle name?
Middle name, also an old family name, D-U-K-E, Duke.
So it's R. Duke Watson.
Officially, it's Roe Duke Watson III, but my wife resolved with me there would be no force.
And the unit in training in battle that you served with? In the 10th Mountain Division?
Please repeat.
And what was the name of the unit that you served with in the 10th Mountain Division?
I served in various units because I was involved with the 10th since its inception, but perhaps you mean when we went overseas into combat?
Well, you could actually list all of the ones you went with if you
Well,
remember them.
initially, there was a sort of a select group that had been, through one good fortune or another, assembled together in C Company of the famous old 15th Infantry, which was part of the 3rd Division, located at Fort Lewis, Washington. And we were under the command of Captain Paul Lafferty, and Lieutenant John Woodward was the executive officer. When the 87th Mountain Infantry was finally activated, it existed on paper, but it had only one person assigned to it. That was Private Charles McLean, who had been captain of the Dartmouth ski team. And when it was activated, we were transferred, the whole group of us, Lafferty, Woodward, and about 15 or so enlisted men, of which I was one, into Company A of the 87th Mountain Infantry. And A was the only company at the very start, but very promptly a full battalion was built up with companies B, C, and D associated. And then the 2nd and 3rd battalions to constitute the regiment came a little later. So I was originally in Company A, but about midway through our wonderful experience up at Mount Rainier, my time came to go down to Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. So I, with much regret, departed from Mount Rainier and headed down to Georgia with the assurance that I would be returning as a lieutenant. Obviously, I couldn't return to the company I'd been with as an enlisted man, so by the time I got back 3 months later, there was not only a new battalion, but a couple of new regiments. But I was put into Company F of the 87th, and I spent several months there, then I should say several weeks there, and then was sent on a special expedition to the Columbia ice fields, where we were for several months. Upon return from that, I was assigned to G Company of the 87th, and so it goes. I was with G Company until midwinter, when the 87th was moved very abruptly to Fort Ord, California. That was preliminary to their escapade up to Kiska in the Aleutians. But just before that happened, orders came through that transferred me to the 10th Reconnaissance Troop, which was commanded by my old friend John Woodward. And I became the executive officer of the 10th Recon, which was a wonderful outfit. We had just a stalwart group. I would like to have continued on that through the rest of my military experience, but it all broke up when we later on were in our preparation for overseas movement. I'm winding around here, but these are the various units I was with. I was sent, however, for several months to the West Virginia maneuver area, where I ultimately commanded the Seneca Rock Climbing School, which was an interesting project. And upon return from that, by the time we broke that organization up, the whole 10th Division had moved from Camp Hale, Colorado to Camp Swift, Texas. So as we left West Virginia, we, by one means or another, headed for our new establishment at Camp Swift, Texas. And upon arrival there, I was given command of I Company of the 86th. First time I had been in the 86th, but that's where I served out the rest of my career.
That was a long answer.
Too long?
No, it's fine. I had no idea.
Maybe I shouldn't ramble that much.
No, that was fine. Why you wanted to be in the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, that wasn't a hard choice. It was a very fortuitous circumstance as far as I was concerned. I'd had 2 years of military training in it, because I'd gone to a military prep school, which pre-World War II were quite popular through the Midwest and the South, and I'd gone to the Western Military Academy. Had I gone for 4 years, I would have automatically had a commission by the time I became 21, but I went for only my upper 2 years of high school, junior and senior years, so that really did nothing for me. When I went to college, I enrolled in ROTC, which was voluntary at the university I went to, the University of Michigan, which was not a land grant school, so ROTC wasn't required. But in any event, I had to repeat the courses I'd had at prep school. And by the time my junior and senior years came along, my agenda was too crowded to work the ROTC part in. So I never did get my commission, much to my disappointment. And I was caught up in the second draft after it started. A lot of people don't remember that the first draft was in October of 1940, which was, of course, well before Pearl Harbor. And the second draft didn't come along until early March of 41, and I was picked off for that. I was living and working shortly out of college in Everett, Washington. And so I was sent to a reception center at Fort Lewis, Washington. After a few days there, was assigned to Infantry Training Center at Camp, I'm drawing a mental lapse on the name of that camp, but it was in California near Paso Robles. And after my 13 weeks of basic training there, because I had this background in ROTC and was one of the few college graduates, I was chosen to stay on the training cadre there as other troops were brought in, or other units of draftees. And during the course of the remainder of that summer, which would have been the summer of 1941, I ran into a chap quite inadvertently who had come down from Fort Lewis and seemed to know something in a vague way about a mountain training unit that was going to be established. And all he knew was that A key person in connection with that was a Captain Paul Lafferty in C Company of the 15th Infantry. Well, I had a cousin on duty who was a young lieutenant at Fort Lewis, so I got hold of him by telephone and immediately had him look up Captain Lafferty and investigate the matter a little more. I got a report back from my cousin that Lafferty seemed very interested, that I had some mountain climbing experience, although not very much of a skiing background. I was still somewhere between beginner and intermediate. But I was told to send whatever credentials I thought were appropriate to Captain Lafferty, which I did. That was probably in the month of August. And then I went away for my first furlough to take a hike. It was about a week long, maybe 9 or 10 days, hiking the John Muir Trail in the Sierra Nevada mountains. When I came back from that, there were 2 orders that had come through for me. One was my transfer to C Company of the 15th Infantry, which I was delighted to see, and the other was my assignment to go to Officer Candidate School. Had I chosen to do that, I would have been in class number 4, which was one of the very early of many, many classes that went through training, turning out lieutenants for the expanding Army. My company commander presented me with these 2 orders, and he said, well, it's easy to see which one you're going to choose. And I said, well, sir, this may surprise you, but I'm going to choose to go up to Fort Lewis, transferring in my enlisted grade. And he said, Watson, you can't do that. He said, there's a war on, man. Here's your chance to go down to Fort Benning, and you'll be a lieutenant before you know it. He said, you think it over overnight. So the next morning he said, Watson, you ready to have me sign an order? And I said, yes, sir. It's going to disappoint you. I'm still going to go to Fort Lewis. I'm fascinated with any unit that may be attached to the mountains or winter warfare or skiing. He said, Watson, you're a damn fool, but I'll sign your order, which he did. So I was on my way to Fort Lewis, and upon arrival, reported in to Company C, and thereupon met Captain Paul Lafferty and Lieutenant John Woodward, both of whom became lifelong friends. So that was my introduction, but there was never any doubt in my mind on where I wanted to be in the service.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the quality of the officers that you encountered in the 10th Mountain Division along the way.
As compared with other units, or
just how you felt about the officers of the 10th Mountain
Well,
Division?
of course, I being part of them, we had a tremendous camaraderie, as did most of our enlisted men, especially in the earlier days. As shortly before we went overseas, the division needed to be built up to full strength, and all sorts of personnel, both officers and enlisted men, were introduced just by hook or crook. They not knowing why they were being put in there, maybe it had no mountain or skiing experience, and but they were just to be used as fillers. But prior to that, everyone, both officer and enlisted man, were almost without exception there because they'd volunteered or had some special qualifications. So it made a very cohesive group. We all had these common interests. So in answer to your question, I just had a wonderful camaraderie with fellow officers throughout the division. We all got to know each other, or practically all of us. There are a lot of officers in a full-strength division, but I think as I saw the division grow, I got to know almost all of the officer personnel. Now, It was another matter to get to know the enlisted men because you got to know those serving directly under you, but you had no reason to have contact with any of the others. But I know they also enjoyed a great camaraderie. And I think there was definitely more of a bind there than probably in the average division because of our very explicit common interest.
Explain for me what some of the training was like on Mount Rainier in the early days.
Well, some of it was fairly rigorous. We couldn't wait to get up there, and things dragged. The 1st Battalion had been created just about a week before Christmas in '41, which is just a little over a month after Pearl Harbor. And we knew that the thought was that we were going to be training at Mount Rainier, up at the Paradise Ski Resort. And I shouldn't call it a ski resort. The Paradise was a national park location up at the Timberline, a beautiful spot on the south side of Mount Rainier. And it was used year-round, but the Army arranged to take over all but one of the buildings up there, but nothing seemed to happen. And first the year came and the weeks began to roll by, and we thought, well, this is the old Army game of waiting, but very suddenly we got the word, we're moving to Mount Rainier, and we had about less than 24 hours to prepare for it. And I guess, come to think of it, during that intensive period, we were getting outfitted with the Army's new winter equipment, which meant skis, ski boots, ski clothing, and all the rest of the special packs that were created for us. And so that kept us all busy during probably a little longer than a 24-hour period. And I think it was the last week of January that we moved up there, but I'd have to double check my records on that. When we back to your original question, however, we thought this was just going to be a blissful holiday, and it was in part, but 5 days of the week it really wasn't. 5 days of the week we were, our time was divided between basic ski instruction, and of course the more qualified skiers were immediately selected as instructors, and then the rest, whether they were almost beginners or intermediates, were all given instruction depending on their abilities. But that was combined right off the bat with starting maneuvers with full field packs. And of course this was very vital to the Army's needs to plan. Nobody was sure with the equipment that had been turned out by the Quartermaster Corps how the weight of our full field packs was going to work on skis. It was largely a big experiment. But we were soon put on skis after a morning's training on ski instruction. After lunch, this is usually the way it worked out, we'd be ordered to turn out with our full field equipment, and that meant pack with overnight gear in it, rifles, ammunition belts, and so on. We didn't wear helmets, we wore ski caps. And we would trek off as best we could because some of the group were not too spry on skis yet. And so the maneuvers to begin with were a bit basic, but soon developed into more and more difficult terrain. And so it turned out with heavy packs, both going up and coming down, that it was more work than play. And that went on for 5 days a week. It was pretty grueling, but nevertheless, 90% of the personnel were just delighted to be up there, as difficult as the training might seem. And then came Saturday noon, And from there until taps on Sunday night, it was just the best duty the Army ever saw for all of us. And that was the fact that gas rationing had not started yet, but a lot of the young men in the Seattle-Tacoma area, like all over the country, were being rapidly drafted. And so there was a great surplus of single young women. And when they heard that these mountain troops were training at Mount Rainier, there were scads of delightful young women that would come up to spend the night at Paradise Inn, the one building that was the original big old inn, which still exists today. And that was the one place that was reserved for the public. The Army had taken over all the rest of the buildings. So we just had the best possible weekends with that kind of company. And so that made up for a lot of hard work during the week. But as far as to be specific about the training, before I abruptly left about a month later, about the end of February, for my officer candidate training, we had reached the standpoint where we were climbing fairly high, maybe up to 1,000 feet above Paradise, up above Panorama Dome, up toward McClure Rock and other prominent features on the what is now the usual climbing route going up for the summit. We weren't doing any summit expeditions, of course, at that time. We wouldn't dream of trying to bring a full battalion of men up to the summit of Mount Rainier, but we did maneuver over some fairly rough terrain and went down from Paradise as well, down on trails through the woods. And of course that was, at times it was chaos where there were sharp turns and there'd be big pileups, but mostly that was quite fun, and until the hard work of climbing back up to Paradise began. So we had our work cut out for us, whether we went up from Paradise or down from Paradise. It was rugged terrain and demanded a lot of energy.
Well, it sounds like Paradise in many ways. Can you describe what the accommodations were like at Paradise?
I can to the best of my memory. The Paradise Inn was the deluxe place in those days, and still is. It's the only lodging left on that side of the mountain, and it's this wonderful old inn. It was old even in World War II days. I forget when it was built, but it was somewhere back in the teens. We had the free use of that as part of the public over the weekends, but that was off limits to us the rest of the week. There was a Paradise Lodge, which it was a lesser lodging element, and everything was on a little less expensive and affluent scale there. For instance, the dining was cafeteria style rather than a full dining room. The accommodations, overnight accommodations, were not quite as elegant is hardly the word at Paradise Inn, but Paradise Inn was definitely more upscale in its toilet facilities, showers, and so on than Paradise Lodge. Nonetheless, Paradise Lodge was quite a nice quarters for visiting military troops. Then there were 2 or 3 outlying buildings. There was the what was called the Tattoosh Club. Club's a misnomer because it had been built by the Park Service. I don't know how it got that name, club, but it was a separate little lodging that also, I think, had been available for use by the public. And Company A, which I was a part of, had the good luck to be quartered in the Tattoosh Club. It was just, its accommodation was just large enough for our one company, which was, we weren't quite to full strength, so we were a little under 200 men. So there were close to 200 of us quartered in this building, and needless to say, things were pretty compact. I think the tattoos probably in civilian days normally accommodated 75 people or so thereabouts. So we were tightly quartered, but made the most of it. And of course, it was the environment was so great that nobody minded the congestion. I think we were probably a little favored over the people, the rest of the battalion that was down in the big Paradise Lodge, where I gathered things were even tighter in the lodging part of the area. As I remember, we all ate all our meals down at Paradise Lodge, unless we were eating al fresco midday luncheons.
What was the spirit of the group at the time? Did it feel like you were in the Army?
Oh, the spirit was just marvelous. Well, at times you almost felt you weren't in the Army. It seemed so far from the normal training that most of this group of brand new recruits had been going through, and it was just such a marvelous change, and a change that, of course, all of this personnel were delighted with. Later on, we got both officers and enlisted men, as I think I referred to earlier, that were just arbitrarily assigned, and wondered what on earth they were doing in such an outfit. And there was a common joke about some of the southern group that had christened skis the torture boards. They never did take to the skis. Fortunately, overseas never had to use them, but or most of us didn't in any event. But by and large, all the personnel, especially in those early days, knew why they were there. They wanted to be there, and they loved really every moment of it, even the hard work.
Did you have any sense at that time what sort of mission you were being trained for?
No, there was all sorts of circumspection and guesswork. I think, as I remember, the early suppositions were we would be especially trained to go to Norway. Norway, of course, had been taken over by the Nazis, and Norway had under top secrecy. I don't think we knew this at the time, but the Germans were experimenting with heavy water up in Norway, and of course that was their approach to an atomic bomb. And but Norway seemed to be a key area to possibly invade, and so we thought certainly we would be probably trained for and going to fight in Norway. But that was, I think, as far as any specific training in that direction came. There was volunteer training once we got back to Fort Lewis in the late spring. There was volunteer training to take evening classes in Norwegian language, and quite a few, both officers and men, were volunteering for that work.
Did you find that you were trained much by expatriates from Norway or from the European mountain countries?
We had, yes, we had a number of consultants, and I wish I could remember names better. A lot of them are on the tip of my tongue. And Abbie, I'm sure you know a few of them. But we had consultants from the Norwegian Army. We had, I believe, from both Sweden and Finland, we had consultants. There was a colonel from the Norwegian Army who was very prominent with us, and became a member of this mountain training center. So I had further contact with him. So there were a number of, more than just a handful of personnel from various European units. Interestingly, none from They were all from the north, none from the Alps, none from Italy where we ended up fighting, or obviously not from Austria or Bavaria because they would have been on the other side.
What sort of things did these Scandinavian coaches teach you, and did it save your life?
Well, I'm not sure that the Scandinavian, they weren't actively teaching. They were not in the role of teaching for the most part. They were on a little higher level of consulting in strategy and with the higher command. And I don't recall any of the Europeans that were attached to our unit actually giving instruction. There was one exception, although it wasn't a European, but it was a man of Icelandic heritage, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who was an Arctic expert, and this was long after Mount Rainier. It was a couple of winters later at Camp Hale, Colorado, that Stefansson spent a month with the troops on such things as igloo building and other Arctic specialties, which was very interesting. But Stefansson was a Canadian of Icelandic origin, so he was not really one of the European group.
What sort of influence did the European group have on the early stages of the 10th formation?
I'm not sure how to answer that. My knowledge of their association over the years has dimmed enough but my best remembrance is that in those very early days there weren't many of them really there. There were probably 2 or 3. Later on there were quite a number after we'd moved over to Camp Hale. But they, again, I want to repeat, they weren't working with the troops too much in actual instruction, so I don't think any of us say we really owed too much directly to their knowledge, but probably that was infiltrated through higher command and it became part of our preparation without most of us being really very aware of it. Now the exception was the colonel that worked closely with us in the Mountain Training Center. When I was in the 10th Recon Troop, we had direct experience with him, and he was a delightful gentleman. He was a full colonel in the Norwegian service, but a very personable individual that everyone really liked and admired. And he would go on various maneuvers with us and activities and did offer good training advice.
Now you had a lot of expertise assembled there at Mount Rainier in the early days. Were you aware that you had some pretty prominent people in the mountain?
Oh, we certainly did, but these were people who were integral part of our unit, which is probably what you're implying. Yeah, there was, I take it back about no one from the Alps. That's not quite true. We had one person of considerable renown. He was a Swiss named Peter Gabriel, who was used as a consultant on any number of things. And as a matter of fact, the following summer after the Mount Rainier experience, there was a team picked. I would have given a lot to me on that team, but it was about the time I was shipped up to the Columbia ice fields in Alberta, which was another choice assignment. So I didn't complain about that, but there was a hand-picked group that made a climb of Mount Rainier, and Peter Gabriel was one of the leaders of that climb. And I think that, Peter was a very likable individual. I don't think he was considered all that much of an expert in his climbing ability. he was a little older, and I don't want to denigrate him at all, but I don't believe he meant that much to the climbing team.
Can you tell me what the most challenging part was of training at Mount Rainier?
At Mount Rainier. Well, I think maybe I've touched on it in a general way. It would have been the ability to put on a 70-pound pack, and they were just about 70 pounds, I think we were training with to a large extent, and chugging uphill for maybe 500 to 1,000 vertical feet. That was physically a big challenge. Now, some of us are better equipped than others, but we all had to get used to new equipment. These skis were pretty good skis for that period, but they couldn't compare to a modern ski. And our climbing skins weren't skin, of course, they were mohair, but they worked fairly well, but they were a bit cumbersome in putting on, and then when they got frozen up and taking them off. But just carrying those loads up, and then even more of a challenge, skiing down with them, and maintaining some sort of cohesion instead of everybody scattering to the four winds going downhill, took quite a bit of concentration, and that was a challenge. I think that was our biggest challenge at Mount Rainier.
Can you recall any specific maneuvers that were particularly challenging?
Trying to remember what the most. I have to qualify that answer because things progressed week by week into more challenging, if you will, experiences as training developed and the group as a whole made progress. So more difficult maneuvers were conducted. But as I mentioned earlier, midway through all this, I was abruptly ordered to leave and head for Fort Benning to Officer Candidate School. So I missed all the latter part where probably the most challenging maneuvers took place. So I was probably, in the month that I was there, actually, from my individual standpoint, I didn't find anything too difficult. I was able to handle those heavy loads pretty well. And it depended to a certain extent on one's physical strength. I think we had some smaller men who were superb skiers, but they were so lightweight and simply small in structure, physical structure, that they just had a terrible time with those heavy packs because the load and one's weapon and so on weren't graduated to the size of the man. Everybody carried the same loads, and a 125 or 130 pound chap had a lot more difficulty as a whole than a 175 pounder who was in good shape.
Do you remember testing equipment?
Well, I certainly remember our testing, our skis, our rucksacks as a load. I cannot recall, no, I do recall, we did not have a mountain ration at Mount Rainier. The Quartermaster Corps was working on that, but that didn't get distributed to us until we got to Camp Hale, Colorado.
What were you eating?
Well, I wish I could, our Army chow, as the lingo goes, was just regular Army fare morning and night, and most of the time for lunch also. I think there were very few times when we took field rations, and to tell you the truth, I cannot remember what sort of rations those were at Mount Rainier. I know that probably there were, I'm speculating a little bit, but probably the standard Army C ration, which came out of a little can, and there was a certain variety to it. Though I think those were in use, and we probably had those to take on our outings where we did dine in the open. But our mountain ration, which was really, I think the Quartermaster Corps did a very good job of it, but that did not become available until later on.
Did you ever hear about people testing rations that were really high in fat versus people who were eating more standard rations? Pemmican, fat. And
there was a great deal of effort put into that, but that was largely done by the Quartermaster Corps and this Winter Warfare Board, which worked in close conjunction with the Mountain Training Center. But they had some specialists that were working on that, and most of us didn't get into the details there.
I'm going to stop and switch tapes real quick.